Hello, and welcome to another episode of Get Your Fill Financial Independence and Long Life, where we explore ways to achieve those two goals and ways to become better and more financially viable entrepreneurs, working and living while we're really loving our lives. And that's one of the reasons I'm very excited today that David Edwards is here with us. David R. Edwards. Make sure we get the R. David was in healthcare for 35 years, and then he had like an epiphany. And so after 2 years of research, he published his book, which is called Knew You, Who Knew? So David, thank you so much for being with us today.
It's a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So tell me a little bit about what it was about your healthcare career that kind of gave you this like, boom, we need something more. There's a book here that needs to be written.
I'd love to. It's interesting.
Awesome.
as I think about my career, it's been very atypical, I would say, but I've worked in like primary care, specialty care, hospital care, elder care, never with youth other than as a part of like a family practice. But I've been able to do different things. I worked in Africa for a while, in Nigeria, and I've been able to be a part of some really interesting things. But since about, 2010, I was working in integrated primary care.
So what is integrated kind of, how does integrated kind of, for the layperson, what does that really mean?
So what it means is that we had this revelation, this amazing insight, is that you and I and everybody listening or watching was born all connected. Our head, our mouth, our shoulders, our heart, right? Everything's connected. And everything that goes on our head, right, affects our body, and everything goes on our body affects our head. And you can't really separate them and be as effective, right? And so we had this kind of amazing idea that let's design our services around you as a whole person.
That seems pretty radical.
Pretty radical, right? Right. And when I was in graduate school, and I have a master's in business, but my emphasis was in healthcare administration. And there's this, what's that book called now? Oh shoot. Now I can't think of the name of the book, but this big fat book, it won a Pulitzer Prize. And it was about like the history, the evolution of healthcare. It's like the social democratization of healthcare. That's the wrong title, but anyway, something like that.
I haven't read it, so it's safe to say.
Most people haven't read it. And it talks about how we evolved in a guild system, right? So like surgeons, if you go back into the 1800s, they were a part of the barbers union. Why? Because the barbers sterilized their instruments, and so did the surgeons, and maybe they used the same jar. I don't know. But, we evolved in these guilds because how society was built, right? There was wheelwrights and pipe fitters and barbers and et cetera, et cetera. And so medicine and healthcare in the Western world, evolved along this lines of, well, I'm in this guild and you're in that guild. So I look at hearts, I look at heads, I look at mouths, I look at this, and that's just evolved, right? It's gotten more and more broken down into greater and greater detail. It's what's sometimes called a reductionist model. And there's a lot of advantage to that. I don't want to speak ill against it. And it's not like somebody said, we're going to do it this way. It just evolved and naturally.
Yeah.
But the downside of it is that, now when you think about going to the doctor, you go to this doctor for that thing and another doctor for another thing, et cetera. And very likely they never talk to each other. They don't share information. And so we thought we're going to take the kind of what we thought were the essential elements of integrated you as a whole person primary care. And so it wasn't like, what it was like then is that in one setting, we would have a dentist and a hygienist and a primary care physician and a nurse practitioner. And we might have pediatrics, so we might have a little geriatrics. We would have a therapist or a psychologist. We might have a caseworker, a health coach, a community health worker, and it just kind of grew and expanded over time.
Interesting.
And the idea was that we will flex around what you need. So you might be, so Christine, I don't know about you. I don't know you very well, right? You don't know me very well, but I'm going to assume that you're relatively healthy. So you might not go to the doctor, but every now and again, when something complains or something happens, right? Somebody else listening might go to the doctor pretty regularly. And maybe they have some depression they're dealing with, right? And then they might have diabetes, or they might, this or that. So there might be a combination of things. So you are unique as an individual, as am I, as is the neighbor next door and the neighbor on the other side. And so it's not a one size fits all. It's really a system that flexes around you and your needs as a whole person. And again, we can only go so far, and then you need a little bit of reductionism because you need somebody who knows your heart better if you've got congestive heart failure, or et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
And we're grateful for these good people. But on the whole, on average, most people really need a place where they connect with a group of people who care about them and see them as this whole person, and who also recognize that the vast majority of your life is outside of the clinic or the health center, right? I mean, the vast majority of your life. And so that hour, whether it's an hour every other week or it's an hour every other year, most of your life is outside.
Yeah.
And so we had this opportunity to build a new health center. We'd grown to a point and we'd developed a great reputation, and we were financially secure and all those kinds of things, where we were going to build a $16 million new health center, and twice the size of the old one. And as we were designing and using this multidisciplinary team, I had my first epiphany. After 35 years, I don't know, I'm a little slow maybe, but and I realized we've got all these amazing people. We'd been very fortunate to hire some really amazing people who realized that they weren't the center of the universe, that you, the patient, are the center of the universe, and that we are members of a team, which means that you, Christine, are the captain of this team.
Wow.
Not the physician, not the therapist, not the health coach, not the whatever, right? You're the captain of this team. And I realized we can have the best computers and the coolest building and biophilic design and all these wonderful vaunted things that nobody had ever heard of, including slap them around our architect. But, we could do all these cool things, but unless we could help you fulfill this role as the captain of the care team more effectively, we would vastly limit our effectiveness. And we didn't want to do that, right? We wanted to vastly increase our effectiveness. So we wanted to have more impact, be more helpful for folks. And so, and I was a little embarrassed because I thought, well, I don't even know what that means, right? I don't know what the captain of a ship is, but I doubt that's what we're looking for. So what does it mean to be the captain of the care team? And I started talking to team members, what do you see? What makes people successful? And the discussion led to this idea of change. And there's two basic kinds of change. There's the change that we direct that's inside, right? It comes from inside out. And then there's change of keeping up with what's going on outside, things that we don't control, but we have to adapt to. So for example, way early in my career, I won't say how early, but we bought a modem for the computer. And the modem was twice as big as this tablet. It weighed about 20 pounds. And it was barely dial-up speed, and it cost a couple $1,000s. But we plugged that in, at our site that was 20 miles away into the main site, and we could connect, and we were like thrilled to death. We could send a little bit of data. No video conferencing, please, right? But today, that thing is a paperweight. It's worse than that. It's landfill, right? And today we have Zoom. or WebEx, or, whatever the technology, and we can talk, we can listen, we can put up slides, we can do all this cool stuff. So there's outside change that we need to keep up with. And it's important, right? It's important because if we don't, we become less and less relevant, and we become less and less capable of actually directing our own lives. And so we want to keep up, is keeping up with the change inside, this self-directed change, this idea that I'm the captain, not only of my care team, because as I started thinking about this more, I realized that these ideas and these principles are really applicable to all domains of life. So if we can help people become the captain of their care team to manage change from an internal and external perspective successfully, more successfully, then they will actually be the captain of their entire life, right? These skills were universal. They were broadly applicable to all domains. And so the second epiphany around change models was that at the core of all these different change models that I was studying, and was a wonderful learning journey for me, was this idea of personal or intrinsic motivation. So we all are familiar with motivation, but we generally think of like, if I buy a lottery ticket, I could win, $10 million. So there's a motivation to buy a lottery ticket. Or if I'm at work and I meet certain goals, I might get a bonus. Or if I belong to the gym and I lose 10 pounds, they might ring the bell for me once I've, met my goal, right? These are versions of external motivation. There's nothing wrong with external motivation, right? It's great. And we want to use that as a tool to help us move forward, to meet our goals, accomplish the things that we want to do. But almost always, external motivation is designed to help us to do something that somebody else wants us to do. Not always, but very often. And the advantage of his internal or personal motivation, or intrinsic, as the therapists and scientists call it, the idea there is that this comes from within. And even if I don't have anybody else cheering me on, I can do, and more importantly, perhaps become more amazing. And it all comes from within inside. I don't need outside external measures or metrics or rah-rahs or financial or whatever. This comes from inside. This is our passion. This is that thing that drives you in the morning to get up and do a podcast. This is the thing, that says, I love, whatever it happens to be. I love gardening. And so nobody has to give you a pep talk to get out and go gardening, because you love to do that, right? Mm-hmm. It's the actual process of the thing that you're doing. And so this comes from inside, though, not from outside. And that's really one of the beautiful things about it, because we want you and all those listening, that means you, to be the captain of your own life. We want you to be self-directed, self-motivated, so that when you get to a certain point in life, you go, I lived my life the way that I wanted to. I did the things that I really wanted to, the things that are meaningful to me, the things that provide meaning to my life. And hopefully, right, they bring other kinds of success as well. And I think that generally that is true as we align our lives with the principles that, I hate to use the word control, but that guide human or influence human success, right? We will find we're not only accomplished in a kind of an external kind of a way, because you have a really nice library, or maybe more importantly, right, it's in who you've become in that process. And the nice thing about that is, and I'm almost done with my story here, but I was fired from this job that I really loved, and we were doing all these amazing things. And I had a disagreement with my board, and I lost the argument. which was unfortunate. And it was kind of crushing to me because it was like Monday morning and they called me in and said, "You're gone. Sorry, thanks for your service." And, and
Oh,
I was like, wait a minute, we're like in construction on this amazing thing. We've got all these great projects going on. We've done all these great things the last 5 years, but I want to say this now. The nice thing about your intrinsic or your internal motivation and what you become as a human being as a result of that is that nobody can fire you, right? Nobody can take that away. Nobody can lay it off. Nobody can disrespect it because it's you. It's simply who you have become. And this is a position of power for you because whatever else you are doing, whatever outside stuff is going on, you have this position of power from whom you have or who you have become as a result of aligning yourself with these principles. And it was really quite amazing. And I was able, because I had time to spend that 2 years you talked about, mostly like researching and reading and writing and testing and learning. And I should have gone to school. I'd have a PhD by now. But anyways, it was all self-directed. And it ended up with the better part of 2021 actually writing the book. And it was just published earlier this year.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
So how do you think this philosophy, that the way that you're presenting this intrinsic motivation differs from what you read in most of the kind of books that try to help people to become better, like philosophically or?
Well, it's interesting because I've been like a chief financial officer or a chief operating officer or a chief executive officer, chief of something for 30 years, probably. I was part of a fast growing company and I kind of evolved very quickly in that regard. Never made a lot of money because
we lost you there.
I've read a lot of books about motivation, right? Because from a business sense though, right, we're interested in motivation from what I can get you to do.
Right.
Right. I mean, that's what and you look, I mean, some really good books have been written just in the last couple of years. And they're inevitably focused on what are the levers that I pull, right? To get people motivated, to get them to do what I want them to do, as opposed to having them develop this capacity and this power as an individual that aligns their passions, their interests, their values with what we're doing as a company. So this motivation comes about naturally and is in fact develops who the individual becomes, as well as accomplishing the business's goals, because all businesses have goals and that's great. You need goals. But I think the difference in this perspective and the difference in what I wrote is it focuses on you and the underlying principles that develop that motivation for you. So this is a capacity building exercise, if you will. And as a result of building that capacity, your ability to do more stuff, right? Because we all want to do more stuff, right? We want to meet our goals. We want to lose weight, or we want to make more money. We want to have a successful business. We want to do whatever these external things are, right? But it does that by building who you are. So it might be a little more slowly, but then again, all things in nature, the most amazing, the biggest and the grandest things in nature start small, right? A sequoia starts as a seed from a pine cone and becomes this amazing, miraculous thing that, 800 years later, they can cut a hole in the middle of it and drive a car through it. Well, aren't we wise? But
great use of a tree.
I know. but it's an amazing thing, but it starts small and it grows steadily, right? As its capacity, which is balanced, right, increases in order to build all of that structure. And that's what I see, kind of looking at this from a more natural metaphor, because we're natural beings, right? We are human beings were not machines. And I mean, we're human beings. And so what we want to do is grow in balance. Because if we get a lot of stuff done, which would be like in a tree, think like a cherry tree, for example, we want lots of fruit. We want those branches to go out and reach high in the sky and heavily laden. We want all that fruit because that's the idea, right? That's why we want that tree. But if you have a weak trunk and a weak roots, what happens is if you get a little bit of wind blowing, then the tree tends to blow over. What happens is if we want to grow lots of fruit and we try to grow lots of fruit, but we haven't built a root structure, what we'll find is we're frustrated because we want lots of fruit. We think we're doing all the busy work to make lots of fruit, but we haven't built a root structure that brings nutrients from the ground to actually allow that fruit to grow and flourish, to grow the branches and the leaves and all the things that need to happen in order to bear fruit, right? And so if we look at ourselves in a natural way, what we want to do is build roots and a trunk that are strong and flexible, that are deep and wide. And what's the natural outcome of that? The natural outcome is that we are both balanced, right? So that it's consistent, right? A capacity that we've built with the outcome that we're seeking, which means that in the good times, we're going to produce more than we ever would have. And in the bad times, we avoid catastrophic failure, breakdown, depression, anxiety, things that are epidemic in today's society. We avoid those kinds of catastrophic failures because even in the worst times, when it's like this year in the West Coast, it's like this cold, wet spring, the garden's hardly doing anything. And it's just that kind of a year. But in that year, when you've got all that foundation built, you're going to produce more than you would have if you didn't have that. And you're going to survive and thrive through less favorable circumstances, if you will, right? And so whether times are good or times are hard, we're better off as a result of building these foundations, which maybe takes a little bit of time, but we're going to be more successful. We're going to remain more connected, and we're going to remain more balanced, and we're going to have more meaning in our life. We're going to have more outcome or output, which is a nice thing. We're going to feel like our life is more meaningful. It's just such a win-win-win. I've not, in any discussion with anybody so far, I haven't really found a downside unless you're so anxious to grow so fast and to get so far that you just can't afford to build up these foundations, right? Then this could be frustrating for you. But I'm sorry for that. But it's just like gravity. If I want to fly, I cannot ignore gravity. I cannot ignore the principles of lift and acceleration because those are essential. And I can try all I want, but if I don't align with all those principles, I will never get off the ground, no matter how fast I run or how big my wings are, because something will be out of whack. It'll be out of balance and I'm going to fail. And just like that in life, we may be successful for a little while. We can cheat a little bit, but we will always pay the piper. And so we want to align with these principles that guide human success, and then we will simply be more successful. And I think that's the beautiful thing about it.
So how does one go about creating that strong trunk and root system?
So in my book, there are 10 principles. And I recommend, you don't have to do it this way because you know what, if somebody buys the book, it's your book and you can do what you want with it. You are the captain of your life. You're the captain of that reading experience. So, and I'm probably a little bit harsher than I need to be in the book. Not that I'm mean to you or anything like that. In fact, one of the reviewers, they said, it's like having a lesson from my favorite professor. It's encouraging, but not coddling. And so it's not unkind or anything, but I have this rather rigorous process I recommend. And if I could rewrite the book a whole 6 months later, I might soften that a little bit, but I recommend a process called PQ4R. Have you ever heard of that?
I have not, no.
Yeah, most people haven't. I hadn't before I was researching either, because I thought, what's a process that would be simple but rigorous to help people engage with the material? And so PQ4R is really a simple process where you scan the material, you ask some questions. And so at the end of every chapter, I have a place, what questions do you have from your original perusal? And then you actually read the material, and then you answer your questions, right, as best you can. And if you don't have an answer, then please reach out to me and ask me. I may not have the answer. I may, we'll find out and we'll learn together. But then you read. The first R is to read it. Then you review it. Then you recite it, and then I got one R wrong. Then you do a final review. So there's like 4 steps of reading, writing, reviewing, reciting, and reviewing. And what it does is it stores things in long-term memory. It's a way to get things into long-term memory. And I think if I were to rewrite it or modify it or do second edition or whatever, I would do a PQ2R for most people. I think reading, just skimming through is a good idea. And this could be, and it's not just this book, it could be anything where you want to like learn something and retain it, skim it, write questions that engages your thinking brain, which is just a brilliant place to be. And then to write the answers to your questions, and then to kind of go back and review it and say, is there anything else in here that I might have missed? So like a 2R, I think that's good enough for the vast majority of us. I tried to do a PQ4R myself with my own book that I wrote, and I thought, God, this is tedious. And so I don't know that I would recommend the 4R anymore. But if you're trying to get a driver's test, or you're studying for an exam like your realtor's exam, or whatever it might be, the plumber journeyman's exam, or whatever you're interested in, whatever your passions are leading you to do, the most excellent podcaster exam, I don't know if that exists, but you might do a PQ4R, because PQ4R, what it does is it takes material that you want to remember and it places it in long-term memory in your mind, so that 6 months from now, if you just read something and memorized it for the test, 2 weeks later, you aren't going to remember most of it, because that's all short-term memory. PQ4R puts it in long-term memory. So 6 months from now, you go, oh yeah, I remember that, because you placed it in the long-term memory. So if any of that kind of situation, is really a great tool.
Yeah.
So there's a lot on PQ4R. So anyway, the very first chapter is on your values. And this isn't values in some general vague way. This isn't your parents' values or your best friend's values or your spouse's values or anybody else's, right? This is your own values. And it's not vague, it's very specific. And I put it as the first chapter because it really creates a foundation for all the rest of our lives, and on which we can build all the other principles in the book. And so I put it first. And it's very important that we think of these as explicit. And I think that's something that's kind of different than most of the things I read. And so I walk you through the process. This is one of the few things where I basically say, do this, do this, do this, and do this, because the book isn't that kind of a book.
Yeah.
It's not a lot of checklists. But the first chapter is. But the idea still is that you make your own top 5 core values explicit. And so when I say explicit, what that means is you've defined it. So once you've determined your top 5 core values in rank order, and I walk you through a process to get there, then you say, what does this value mean to me? So as an example, one of my core values is to be transparent. And in the business world, there's
Uh-oh. You're frozen, David. So you'll have to repeat from
You
in the
know,
business world. Yeah,
what's
you
that?
froze
Yeah.
for a minute. So just repeat from what you said from in the business world about
Oh,
transparency.
so in
Sorry.
the business world, transparency is uncommon. And so, there's a strategic agenda, but, there's really a hidden secondary agenda that they're
Yeah.
trying to get at. People say one thing to Christine, but to Mary, they said something else, right? There's a lot of lack of transparency, and I didn't have any place for that in my life. So I defined transparency as I tell everybody the same story, and I never have a hidden agenda. And if I can't tell you something because there's a legitimate occasions, I will just simply tell you, I cannot tell you that for these reasons, right? And in business, there are legitimate occasions for that, right? If you're negotiating a contract with a private practice to buy them, and you've said, we're going to have this, I can't talk about it, then you can't talk about it. And so that's legitimate. But then you just say, people, I can't talk about it.
Yeah.
They know that you don't have a hidden agenda. They know that you're not trying to do some kind of an end run. You're not trying to pit this person against that person or any of these kinds of things that go on. So for me, transparency is important. I defined what it meant. The second thing to make it explicit is you describe what does that look like, right? So I thought, when I'm like doing the budgeting, I was a chief financial officer. When I'm doing budgeting, I don't give you inflated numbers knowing that you're going to try to, how can I say this? I don't give you low numbers knowing that you're going to try to inflate your numbers and that we meet in the middle. I call it budget monkey business.
Yeah.
And so, I defined what that meant to me in the situation that I was working in. And it could be in your personal life. If that's an issue, in a personal life, you might define that from a personal perspective as well. And then lastly, the third thing you do is you describe, well, why am I better off? Right. And so for this one, I thought, like I noted earlier, I'm just not that smart. And so if I have to remember what I told Christine, and if I told Mary something different, and if I told John, the boss, something different still, and I have to keep track of all of these three storylines, well, I'm lost, I'm toast. And so, that's why my life is better, because I just tell things as they are, and nobody really has to wonder, because they know that I don't do any of that kind of double dealing monkey business. And so we do that for each of our values, and it makes them explicit. It also facilitates us living those values because it's so explicit, and we've defined why we're better off for doing it. So then when we have a moment comes up, because maybe one of these values is aspirational, right? Something I'm striving to become, then we can catch ourselves and go, oh, wait a minute, that's not consistent with my values. I can do better. And that really leads to the second principle, which is awareness. So awareness, you have both self-awareness and awareness of what's going on around you. Because remember, this whole book is about you being balanced. So it's not just ruminating in my own mind. It's not just focusing on what's outside, right? It's the combination of both and in concert. And so this very simple thing that a takeaway somebody could take from this, that I highly recommend, that encourages awareness, is to start your morning with being intentional, which is actually the fourth principle, and end your day by being accountable. And there's a lot of ways you can do that. Something I personally struggle with, maybe it's the male gene, maybe it's just how I was raised, whatever, is journaling, though. Journaling is very powerful. I struggle with it. I started to journal where I wrote the book, and I made it for a few weeks, and then like 2 months later, I was like, oh, wait a minute, yeah,
Oh, that's right, I'm journaling. Darn it.
Yeah, I'm journaling, yeah. And so, in a spirit of we're all human beings and we have different strengths, and you're right, and maybe that's not the best way, but I will tell you, I'm very diligent. I think 99 days out of 100, I end my day thinking, how did I do today? Right? So this morning, this was my intent. And it could be around your values, maybe something aspirational. It could be around a habit you're trying to develop. It could be around a goal that you have. It could be, who you're trying to become. Whatever it is, right? You're intentional in the morning. And it can't be 50 things because, that just
Right.
doesn't work, right? What did you have for dinner last night? We ask, right? And well, what was that,
I
right?
know.
So we can't have 50 things. And that's why there's only 5 core values, because you have other things that are important to you, which is great. We're not denigrating that at all, but we're just saying to guide your life, if you know your top 5 and they're explicit, they are going to significantly influence your life in a positive way. And the researchers, the scientists that have studied this, which I was shocked, I didn't know anybody had actually studied it, right? But the scientists have actually studied this extensively, especially in the last 20, 30 years. And the benefits to you are a greater sense of meaning in life. So like my life has purpose, right? A greater sense of well-being. And well-being, we could understand, is a sense that my life is okay, right? My life is on track. So that sense of well-being, greater focus, right? Because you're focusing on values, which is this foundational aspect of your motivation, which is why you actually do things, right? As opposed to not doing them, right? And you have less regret. Can you imagine? Having regret is like having a backpack on your back and you keep throwing stones in that sucker because, oh man, I wish I hadn't done that. And you throw that stone and then it weighs you down, right? And so what we want to do is like dump all the stuff out of the backpack and not feed it, right?
Yeah.
And so when we actually have made our values explicit and something happens that in the past might have led to a vague sense of uneasiness, like I was asked to do this, or I made this comment that was out of character, right? Instead of that being some vague thing that I regret, I have this explicit understanding of myself, this awareness that I've reinforced through my intentionality in the morning and my accountability in the evening, so that I don't regret that, because I catch myself when I'm in the moment and I go, oh yeah, no, that's not me. And then I do better and I don't have anything to regret. I was listening to something this weekend, actually. I'd never heard this before. It's this idea of living our values at the speed of thought. In other words, before it becomes an action, right, we check ourselves. We use that marvelous prefrontal cortex, that executive center, where we go, oh, I'm not going to say this thing to my partner that is off the cuff because I'm tired or mad or frustrated, or he or she did something or whatever, right? I'm going to catch myself. I go, oh, no, that isn't going to help, right? And then we think and we do something better, right? So we correct ourselves at the speed of thought. I love that idea.
Yeah.
Oh, you're
think,
muted. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, I think a lot of us have that problem though. I mean, right? It's out of your mouth before you even recognize, and you say, oh geez, I wish I could take that back. Or, oh, I shouldn't have said that. And you can see sometimes just on the person's face, like, oops, that didn't come out the way I wanted to, or maybe it did, but I shouldn't have said it or whatever.
Well, in one of the later chapters, maybe this is another takeaway for people, but something I recommend, because you know what? We're all human beings. And so, the first chapter is on values. The next 6 chapters are on what's called principles of self-efficacy. Mm-hmm. So I don't use that word very often because nobody ever knows what that means, but it sounds kind of cool, right? Well, self-efficacy is a set of these 6 principles that is how we get things done. It's this idea of exercising control over our lives. And then the last 3 principles are about self-compassion, which is a balance to self-efficacy, right? So we can become very accomplished, but very disconnected with our humanity and with those around us. Or we can be very connected to our humanity and never get anything done, right? So both of those are out of balance alone. But on that root ball foundation of values, we can build self-efficacy and self-compassion. So effectiveness and connectedness in balance together, the natural result, the inevitable result, which is bearing lots of wonderful fruit, a big, beautiful tree that we love being around and enjoying the shade from in the summer, right? I mean, that's the inevitable result of it during good times and bad, right? And so these things are all in balance, but we're all human beings. And so I think the ninth principle is this idea of our common humanity. We're not machines. I reject the machine metaphor for people. It's not accurate. It's not right. It doesn't serve us well. It doesn't serve the environment, doesn't serve families or communities or individuals. It's just the wrong metaphor. But we are human beings. And so we make mistakes, right? So we recognize that. And so this is a fun thing. I think it's fun anyways. And so I tell a story. And so I had a really bad day at work. I've been married for 36 years, 37 this year. And so if I go back, say 20 years, I had, I was busy, company was growing and a new chief, whatever officer, and it was a bad day. I was stressed, things didn't go well. I come home late and I find out that my wife didn't make dinner, whatever, right? And I was hoping to have dinner and have a kind ear to listen to my problems, because at that moment, my life was revolving around me. And so I made some comment that was not kind. She'd had a bad day. The kids were colicky, the babies, and it was a bad day. And so she made a comment like we were talking about, right? Because we're human beings. But we didn't catch ourselves. And I ended up storming out the door because, I'm going to go someplace where I'm appreciated. And of course, I call somebody and I say, I just had an argument with my wife and, it didn't go very well. and he says, well, what did you do? And he says, David, I love you, but you're a jerk. That was terrible. Why did you do that? And we talked about it. And so there's a pattern that we can follow. And so what I did was, well, first you've got to go back and you need to, in some humility, go back and correct the situation, right? You need to admit your culpability, and there's no value in helping your partner feel bad about their part. Because you know what? You can only control yourself. You can't control them, and the same for them, right? So you have to focus on you and what you did and what you maybe could have done different. So you've got to go back and repair in the moment. But the next morning when you get up and you begin your morning by being intentional, right? Because we're building these skills as we go along. You go, I don't want to ever do this again, right? I don't like it. It's not good for my wife. It's not good for our kids. It's not good for us in any way, right? So what happened, right? So you review what happened. Then you can say, you replay that in your mind and say, if I were to do it again, not in the heat of the moment, because that usually doesn't work well, but when you're past that moment, you go, what could I do differently? And you replay that script, if you will, in a different way. And then you reinforce in the intentional moment. You say, I'm going to reinforce and say, this is what I want to do in that setting.
Yeah.
And then you go through, and hopefully the next day, because usually our problems aren't fixed in a moment, right? So the next day is likely going to be another rough day as you work through whatever's going on.
Yeah.
But since you started your day with intentionality and you've rehearsed in your mind a different script, a different video, if you will, of what might have happened, right? And so in this setting, I go home, and as I go to the door, I realize, oh gosh, I've got all this pent up anxiety in me. And I take a deep breath, because this is what I rehearsed, right? Work is at work, home is at home. And I'm going to ask my wife how her day was. It's the first words out of my mouth, because I love my wife and I want to be with her for the rest of my life. Long after the job is gone, I will hopefully have this relationship that we've built. And so I open the door and it's a different script. I've played a different video, right? And that's great. And it's a much better start to our evening.
When you could use
Well,
that same technique, that same philosophy, like if you're nervous about making a sales call, or you think, oh, this is going to be really terrible, and I know they're going to reject me, right? You just, like you say, you envision or you play a different video and say, okay, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to be, I brought a flower for the receptionist and I'm going to be really charming and the person's going to receive me really well, right? You just have a whole different energy walking into that meeting, whatever the meeting is, right? Whether it's home or at work.
absolutely, exactly right. Again, I don't think there's any of these principles, which is really the most important thing, is to understand the principle. And there's always some techniques or some tips or some tricks, right? As well, because those things help us implement the principles. But most of what we see out on the world, in the internet, and whatever, in books, in videos, is how to. It's the tips, the tricks, and the techniques. And those things, the 3 T's, without the principles, are kind of shallow. They're kind of hollow, right?
Yeah.
They don't have the same power and
Yeah.
effectiveness. And so I really want to reinforce to folks that really focus on the principles and say, what are the principles that I'm applying in this situation? It could be at home with a spouse. It could be on a sales call. It could be in working with your coworker or your boss or a subordinate, right? I mean, any situation. What are the principles that guide success? And then what are the tips, tricks, and techniques within that principle, right, that add meaning to that help me then make that principle a natural, normal part of my life or of my work.
Mhm.
And when we look at it that way, we're building the roots in the trunk, right?
Yeah.
And we're also getting the fruit. And so keep that stuff in balance, but always keep in mind the principles, because that's the key to the success, not the tip or the trick.
Yeah.
Because what will happen over time is that these things become natural, right? It's the new you that you are becoming,
Yeah.
right? Which is, I went through like 10 titles for the book, and I shared it on Facebook. I actually stood in front of the library. I said, hey, I have this book I'm writing. I have these 3 titles. Which one resonates with you the best, right? I did all kinds of things to try to test it. And this idea of new you, I mean, who knew, is this idea that no matter what your age, no matter what your income, no matter what your cultural background is, your first language, your education level, none of these exterior kind of external measures and ways we define ourselves matter when we align ourselves with these correct principles, because they truly are universal. They're in all domains of life. They're effective. So we don't have to look like enjoy it at work and be embarrassed about it at home, or vice versa. It's not like we can do it with our friends, but not with our family, or,
Right.
they're really there for all domains of life. And so as you align yourself with those, you become a new you, slowly, steadily, making mistakes, right? You take a step back and then hopefully 2 steps forward, right? So
Yep.
it's this kind of herky-jerky process, because we're human beings.
Yep.
So we got to be kind and forgiving to ourselves as well. That's the 8th principle.
Yeah.
So it's this process. But over time, we become a new us, and it's constant and it's ongoing. But it's really a beautiful, strong, sustainable, resilient way to grow your own capacity through thick and
Beautiful.
thin.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So, David, what's the best way for people to get this book?
So right now it's on Amazon as an ebook and as a
Mhm.
paperback. And I just like 2 weeks ago finished the audiobook.
Oh, great.
So you can get it as audio as well. I found this great narrator and producer, and they did a great job. I was just really pleased. Anyway, so we got it in the 3 formats on Amazon, and I just finished publishing it out to a publisher called Ingram Spark.
Hmm.
And so it should be available at some point in bookstores, like Barnes and Noble and other places, your local bookstore.
Great.
Um, so anyways, that's the easiest way to get it. And you can always go to my website because I put updates out there, and I have a blog, and I share insights and little tips and tricks and techniques. But hopefully he'll really share more nuance on the principles, how we can make them a part of our lives to become that new you that we want to become, to be the captain of our life. And that's at www.davidredwards.com. Just my name.
Perfect. Perfect. And all those links and everything will be in the podcast notes. So you can easily catch up with David and make sure that you follow some of these principles. So, David, this has been awesome. But is there anything that you wish I would have asked you, or anything that you really want to share that we just haven't touched on today?
You've given me a very long leash, and I really appreciate that. And you've been a kind and gracious host. And I appreciate your insights, frankly, as well. Um, if anything, I guess, it's just a reminder that we are not machines. We are human beings, right? So give yourself a break, be patient, and then just stick with it and do your best. And if you'll do that consistently, you're going to be successful.
Absolutely. Yeah. Goals are not an excuse to beat yourself up, right?
Exactly right. It's exactly
Excellent.
well. And in this, yeah, it's the 8th chapter, it's the 8th principle. But when we beat up on ourselves, we actually diminish our capacity to overcome the very thing that we're beating ourselves up about. So
Yeah.
it's like a double lose.
Yeah.
But when we're kind to ourselves, we have self-compassion, right? It's actually a double win. And we increase our capacity to overcome that very thing. So
Perfect.
give yourself a break, exercise a little bit of self-compassion. You're a human being, not a machine.
And that's excellent advice. I do hear a lot of people, being kind of hard on themselves, and that doesn't help anybody.
It doesn't. It's absolutely scientifically proven to not work.
And we don't need to do anything that doesn't work. That's for sure.
Exactly. Why would we do that?
Exactly. All right. Thanks, David. And thank you, listener, for listening. I know you have a choice of, I don't know, 2 million podcasts. So I'm really excited and delighted that you're here. I'm thrilled that we're in 50 countries. And I am just psyched and tanked and stoked that that you made it to the end of the podcast today, and that you're going to be back next week for more exciting episodes and cool things that we're going to share. Have a good one.